Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I've been struggling for some while now in a variety of different books, of which The Undivided Past is the latest, with the whole set of issues about how we see the world we belong to and how we see the people who inhabit the world we belong to. And I had one go at this in a book called Class in Britain, which was an attempt to look at the different models of society that we carry around in our heads, of what we think British society looks like. Is there an upper class, middle class, lower class? Is there just a middle class and a lower class? Is there a kind of seamless gradation as one group and status area merges imperceptibly into another? This latest book is a sort of further extension of that, and I think it's pushing this line of interest of mine as far as I want to push it, and probably as far as other people want me to push it as well, which is to try to get behind the categories of identity that we have and that we use in thinking about who we are, who other people are, and what collective groups we belong to. And whether, in fact, it's right and appropriate to think about the world in those terms of collective categories, either actually or latently in conflict. And I want to begin these remarks of mine, therefore, by producing two quotations which exemplify two different ways of thinking about these bigger issues. The first one comes from George W. Bush, and although his syntax is rather suspect, I think his meaning ought to be plain. This is what he said. "When I was coming up, it was a dangerous world, and you knew exactly who they were. It was us versus them, and it was clear who them was." Today we're not so sure who them are, but we know they're still there. So that's George Bush's view of the world, right? And I'll come back to that. Here is Bill Clinton, a rather different formulation. "The world is awash in divisions rooted in the human compulsion to believe our differences are more important than our common humanity. But in fact, our common humanity is more important than our interesting and inevitable differences." So here are two very different ways of thinking about what the world looks like. The George W. Bush view, which is that there is a deep division between us and them, those terms to be filled in different ways depending on which particular categories you're talking about. The Bill Clinton view, on the contrary, that we need to think about this much larger concept of common humanity and the things we have in common rather than the things that divide us. And what I've been playing with is to look at both of those ways of thinking about the world in regard to what seem to me to be the six most significant categories of identity, which may, as it were, be right if George W. Bush is right some of the time, but which may be wrong if Bill Clinton is right some of the time. And those six categories of collective identity are religion, nation, class, gender, race, and civilization. Now, if we take the George W. Bush view of the world, us and them, we can see in each of these cases how us and them might play out. In the case of religion, it might be pagans versus Christians. It might be Islam versus Christianity. It might be Protestants versus Catholics. In the case of nation, it might be Britain versus France in the 18th century, or I suppose it might be Russia versus America in some form in the 20th century. If we take class, then it's the workers versus the bosses for most of the time. If we take gender, it's women versus men, or men versus women. If we take race, it's blacks versus whites. And if we take civilization, it's Gibbon, civilization and barbarism, the fall of the Roman Empire. It's Toynbee, the world is understood in terms of civilizations. And of course, and the final point here, and here in a sense we come back to George W. Bush, it's Samuel P. Huntington and the clash of civilizations. And one of the things that I found rather interesting in exploring the ways in which identities and the world have indeed been described in those riven terms, has been to notice that these are, as it were, incommensurable. Because some people say religion is the most important collective identity, everything else is subordinate. Some people say nation is the most important collective identity, everything else is subordinate. Some people say the same of class, some people say the same of gender, some people say the same of race, and some people say the same of civilization. Well, they can't all be right, self-evidently. And that might lead one to wonder whether the whole idea of thinking about single identities, single collective categories, latently or actually in conflict, is actually a very helpful way to proceed. But that's certainly how George Bush saw the world, and it's certainly, I think, how lots of other people see the world, and on occasions, a point I'll come back to, it may even be right. Sundered humanity, polarized thinking, often, I think, promoted by political leaders and public figures, pundits and commentators and clerics and priests, and in our own time, I think, increasingly promoted by an ever more polarized media, which constantly wishes to set the world up in these adversarial terms. Deeply simplistic, perfectly adjudged to Newsnight or the Today programme. You have one person taking one side, another person taking another. They have a punch-up, and you think that's best how to understand the world. Well, it plays well in terms of box office, but whether it really is a good way and a sophisticated way to understand the world, I'm not sure. Well, actually, I am sure. I don't think it is. It's interesting that in recent years, quite a lot of work has been done which wants to say that we shouldn't see the world in terms of these Manichaean, polarized dichotomies, these adversarial collective identities clashing and in conflict, that we need to think about other ways in which the world works. If one thinks, for example, of Timothy Garton Ash, historian of the present, a lot of Tim's work has been devoted to criticizing and engaging with strident media coverage of events in essentially this adversarial us and them way. If one thinks of Neil MacGregor, both as director of the National Gallery and even more so as director of the British Museum, a huge amount of Neil's work and public presentation of why encyclopedic museums matter is because of his passionate belief and the fact that in many ways the British Museum demonstrates that civilizations have constantly borrowed from each other, have interacted in ways that have been constructive and creative rather than clashing in the Samuel P. Huntington way. So there's quite a lot of work been done of late, it seems to me, by a variety of exceptionally distinguished figures in a variety of different fields, engaging with, and I think dissenting from, the Manichaean view of the world so much liked by George W. Bush. But oddly, I think it's not quite clear where historians fit into this. One of the ways, I think, of thinking about historians is that part of what some of them have done, either deliberately and willfully and by design, or inadvertently, but nevertheless quite powerfully, is that they've helped create these collective identities and these adversarial dichotomies. That historians of religion have, until quite modern times, been either Protestant or Catholic. That historians of nations have wanted to take the view that the nation whose history they were writing was the best nation in the world and all other nations were nothing like as good. Historians of class, if one thinks in particular of the great generation of Marxist historians, Eric Hobsbawm, Christopher Hill, E.P. Thompson, wanted to make the case that the way to understand history was that class was the most important identity and that conflict came out of that. And some historians clearly think that that's part of what they ought to be doing because they are, as it were, campaigners for the causes and the identities in which they believe. That was certainly true of the great generation of Marxist historians whom I've just mentioned. Seen from that perspective, history is an essential part of the ways in which group identity is affirmed and in which the conflictual model of society is proclaimed. And they are, in a sense, saying exactly the same thing as George W. Bush, though with rather more evidence and with rather more elegant language. But there is another way of thinking about what historians ought to do, which is that, in fact, it's not their job to help create such pedigrees for collective identities, because such pedigrees are inevitably, in part, mythological, highly selective. That on the contrary, it's the job of historians to subvert those identities. Let me remind you of the famous observation of Ernst Renan, who said in the 19th century, being a nation means getting your history wrong. And what he meant by that was that the historical narratives that nations create about themselves are invariably very selective. They leave things out which are thought to be regrettable episodes. They take rather unfavourable views of other countries, and they stress admirable episodes. But there is a view then that part of the job of the historian is actually not to be complicit in the creation of these mythologies which help reinforce collective identities, but in fact, on the contrary, to be undermining them. And I quote here from Sir Michael Howard, great historian, who puts this point well. History that challenges the comfortable assumptions and parochial narratives of shared group identity may be painful, but it is also a sign of maturity and wisdom. And that sense that, as it were, being a nation means getting your history wrong, promoting a particular religious identity probably means getting your history wrong, promoting a particular class identity may mean getting your history wrong, promoting a particular gender identity might mean the same, or racial identity or civilization, is, I think, an important point that we need to consider. So what I have been interested to do under the 6 headings of religion, nation, class, gender, race, and civilization, is both to explore the ways in which, using each of these different versions of identity, it has been the case that many people have talked up fundamental divisions. But I've also tried to look at the ways in which, in reality, there were often many conversations across these boundaries of identity in the name of something called common humanity, which have probably received rather less attention than they should. They are to historians what good news is to journalists, things they really aren't very interested in, but which actually are rather important. So let me just give 1 or 2 examples of this to make this a bit more specific than perhaps it's been at the moment. When I was growing up, I remember reading a lesson in my primary school. It was Matthew's, the 25th chapter of the Gospel according to St. Matthew. And it's never quite left me, which may explain in part why I became interested in this subject, because, of course, as you will all remember, it's that famous piece where Jesus Christ talks about the fact that when the day of judgment comes, everybody will be divided up into sheep and goats, and that will be the great division between sheep, who are the good guys, and goats, who are the bad guys. And a large part of what religious propaganda seems to me to have been about across the centuries has indeed been in talking up that division or other versions of religious divisions, claiming one group are saved, the other group are damned, because one group have the hotline to God, whichever version of God it may be, the others don't. The other way of thinking about things is, of course, that within the creed of Christianity itself there is a wholly alternative version. That is to say, love thine enemies, kindness to strangers, turn the other cheek, which isn't at all the same point that's being made in terms of sheep and goats. So that, at least in terms of the Christian doctrine, and I think this is equally true of Islam, what one can find in these doctrines is either a claim that the world is indeed sundered in this brutal Manichaean way between the saved and the damned, or one can find a rather different view of common humanity, kindness to strangers, all equal in the sight of God. And what I've tried to do in the chapter on religion is to explore pagans versus Christians at the time of the fall of the Roman Empire, that famous antithesis developed, of course, by Gibbon, then Christianity and Islam, across from the 7th century to the 19th century. Is that really, as it were, a constant state of tension and conflict, as some people would have us believe? And then, of course, Catholics and Protestants at the time of the Reformation. Religious wars, perhaps the narcissism of minor differences, but a sense that there's no third way of God versus the devil. And what I try to show in each of those cases is that, in fact, those very simple adversarial formulations turn out to be far, far too simple, that there is no such thing as a monolithic paganism and a monolithic Christianity, or a monolithic Christianity and a monolithic Islam, or a monolithic Catholicism and a monolithic Protestantism, but they were always far more fissured, varied and diverse than that, and that in practice, across the centuries, pagans and Christians, Islamic figures and Christians and then Catholics and Protestants have lived together, got on, and often been aware that they worshipped a very similar God, albeit in different ways, and of course a huge amount of cultural borrowing and trade around the Mediterranean for much of this time. And I quote in support of this view some words of Keith Thomas, who observed that one needs to think about this oversimplified division because, and these are his words, it is a salutary warning of the tragic consequences which follow when the world is envisaged as a cosmic battleground on which opposed forces of good and evil contend for supremacy. That, I have to say, I think is absolutely right. Let me look, if I may, at the last of my identificational categories, which is civilization. This book is, in a sense, bounded by Edward Gibbon, because, of course, it's Gibbon who produces Pagans and Christians as a great antithesis in the fall of the Roman Empire, and, of course, it's Gibbon in the late 18th century who famously sets up a new antithesis of conflicting identities in the form of civilization and barbarism. And of course, that for Gibbon is the other explanation of the fall of the Roman Empire. In fact, I think Gibbon's account of it is much more subtle and nuanced than that very simple antithesis, which is later taken up by many people, would suggest. And it's certainly true that work that's been done on the world of late antiquity in recent times suggests that to set it up that way is far too simplistic. The barbarians were extraordinarily varied and diverse groupings whose relations with the Romans or Roman governors or Roman people were a great deal more complicated. The one that I want to look at also is Huntington. Huntington's clash of civilization. Huntington was a Harvard sociologist and political scientist who famously produced articles and a book called The Clash of Civilizations in the late 1990s, and who claimed that the fault lines between civilizations would be the battle lines of the future. And like many people, he produced a map of the world divided up into particular civilizations. And as we all know, there is a rhetoric of maps. And the rhetoric of maps that Huntington went with were these large slabs, as it were, of different civilizations. He never explained how they came into being. He never quite defined what they were. But this, he thought, was how the world was going to be and how the world was. And that, of course, appeared to provide, because one of his civilization groups was Islam, and another was the West, and that appeared to provide exactly the validation for an explanation of the events of 9/11 as a clash of civilizations, which neoconservatives wanted. I think it was a very bad book. Its documentation was very poor. Its definition of civilizations was very bad. Nevertheless, it appeared to depict a world of potential or actual conflicts between large monolithic civilizations, and that appeared to provide an explanation for the events of 9/11. And Tony Blair and George W. Bush bought absolutely into that Manichaean view of the world and the messianic rhetoric which went with it. I don't believe, this is Blair, that what is happening in Iraq today is anything other than an absolutely visceral, profound struggle between what is right and what is wrong. In reply, since, of course, my argument would be, and many other people's argument would be, that to understand the world in terms of these vague, abstract concepts of civilization and to see the world as being best understood in terms of the fact that they are latently or actually in conflict is a grotesque oversimplification of what was in fact going on. And here's Roy Jenkins, in almost his last speech in the House of Lords, making this point rather well. The Prime Minister is a little Manichaean for my perhaps now jaded taste, seeing matters in stark terms of good and evil, black and white, contending with each other, and with the consequent belief that if evil is cast down, good will inevitably follow. And that still seems to me to be an extremely valid way of thinking about things. So I suppose one of the points that I want to make by way of conclusion is that it seems to me we need to think much more critically and carefully about the easy temptation to see the world as divided between us and them, whether it's religion, nation, gender, class, race, or civilization. We need to think much more carefully about how, in practice, the world actually works. And I suppose I have tried to write this book in pursuit of the idea that we ought to be thinking a little bit more about our common humanity and a little bit less about these easy lazy, seductive, simple antitheses. It seems to me it is the job, whether one likes it or not, of politicians and pundits to say the world is very simple. It seems to me it is above all the job of historians to say, no, the world is very complicated, and you ignore that complexity, not just at your peril, but at our peril too. Thank you.